Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to answer them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Maddie Acey. I will be your host for this webinar. Today, we will be pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation titled Success Tips for Getting Started with Family History. After years on the sidelines, Kathryn got started on her family history and discovered a new passion. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success, and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes she's made. Kathryn teaches family history classes at the BYU Family History Library and Riverton FamilySearch Library. She has also written a series for the Nauvoo Times on family history. When she's not doing family history, she enjoys reading, music, and fresh raspberries. And now we will turn the time over to her.
To today's seminar or webinar. We're so grateful to have you with us. This is Success Tips for Getting Started with Family History, or What I Wish I'd Known When I Was Getting Started. And just to let you know, the orientation of this seminar it's geared towards members of the LDS Church that want to get started with their family history and find names for temple work. So what do I wish that I had known when I was getting started with my family history? First of all, I wish that I had known that I had some wrong assumptions, that I needed to verify some of my assumptions and find out what the truth was. Secondly, I wish that I'd understood better the facts about FamilySearch and Family Tree and what their relationship is to each other. I also wish that someone had explained clearly to me what it means to find a name. As common as that phrase is, there's a little bit of misunderstanding around it. And then finally, I wish that someone had explained to me very clearly how to find a place to get started, especially when I was at the very beginning. So let's dive in, and we are going to look at some common assumptions that some of us might hold that might need to be questioned. First of all is an assumption that is pretty common for new users, and that is the assumption that I have to get my family history quote done. A variation on that is that I have to trace my lines clear back to Adam or Noah. The truth is that making a consistent, diligent effort is really what matters. And you might be interested to know that experts agree that it's virtually impossible to trace our lines all the way back to Adam or Noah reliably. So thank goodness that that isn't a requirement. Even if we tie into royal lines, there are enough gaps and questions and so forth that there are probably better ways to spend our time when we're doing our family history. So making a consistent, diligent effort is a really great thing to do. Another assumption that I run into a lot is that people are afraid that they won't be able to find any family names because their family history is, quote, all done. Maybe Aunt Martha has done it all, or they look at their tree and it's just so full in family tree that they can't imagine how they'd be able to find family names. But the truth is, thank goodness, that it's virtually impossible for our family history to be all done in this life. I have yet to meet somebody who had even a full tree who still couldn't find family names. Next assumption that we want to question. Success means finding a lot of names quickly. And sometimes we will hear people talk about maybe finding thousands of names over just a weekend or something like that. The challenge with finding so many names quickly is that it's a great temptation to cut corners. And so often if names are found very quickly, thousands in a weekend, it means that they might not have been verified or checked for duplicates. And that also puts a lot of pressure on a new person if they think that success means that you've got to find a lot of names quickly. I don't believe that assumption. What I believe is that success means consistently and carefully clearing the temple names that I can reasonably do. And you might remember hearing in a general conference address that we're being asked to only clear the number of names that we can reasonably do, not to reserve thousands and thousands, because then they often will just kind of stay in limbo. And a couple of years ago, the church actually started a new policy for North America and Canada, which is that if names have been reserved for more than 2 years, the church reserves the right to unreserve those names from our temple queue so that the work can be done. So don't feel like you're a failure if you don't find a lot of names quickly. Instead, realize that success for you will be consistently and carefully clearing names that you can reasonably handle. Another assumption that is kind of scary for a new user and tends to paralyze some people is that I can't do family history until I'm an expert, and oh my goodness, that's going to take years to master. But I do not believe that either. And I wish that I had known that earlier because I personally did feel a little paralyzed when I was first starting out on my family history, thinking that, oh my goodness, I'm not an expert, so I'm probably going to make some terrible mistake. But what I found out over the years is the best way to learn family history is just by doing it. And none of us can start any place but where we are, right? So we start where we are, we do our best, we dive in, we pray for help, and also finding a trustworthy mentor helps. You may have a friend or a family member that is good at family history, or your ward consultant may be able to help you. So don't feel like you have to wait to do family history until you're an expert. You actually become an expert by doing it. Last assumption, this is actually kind of the opposite of this assumption, the one we just talked about, and this is one that has become more common because of the wonderful technology that we have. And that assumption is that family history is so easy now that I should not have to put a lot of effort into it. And in fact, when working with some new people, they've gotten a little frustrated when they can't just immediately find names. And that, I think, comes from this false assumption that family history ought to be super easy and not take any effort. The truth is, family history is a lot easier than it's been in the past. You know, in the old days, if we didn't have digital records, we had to write to courthouses, wait for answers, etc. And now we have so much at our fingertips. But doing family history still takes care and it does take some effort. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. So those are just some assumptions to keep in mind and to remember that we might need to question those and kind of do a sanity check so that we don't get discouraged or that we don't think, that we don't have wrong expectations about how easy family history should be. So now that we've talked about that, let's go ahead and look at the facts about family search and family tree. We bandy those terms about quite a bit, and I found that often when we sit down and ask ourselves, what really are those things, that we may not know. So let's just look at some of the basics there. So what is Family Search? This is from the Family Search webpage, and Family Search describes themselves as a nonprofit family history organization. So Family Search is not itself a website. Family Search is an organization dedicated to connecting families. But where some of the confusion arises is that Family Search, the organization, does run the Family Search website. And not only that, the Family Search website has a number of different sections to it. And it's good to be familiar with those sections to understand how to get the most out of that website. For instance, there is a section on photos where you can upload your photos and actually even audio files. You can manage those, attach those to people in the tree and so forth. There's also a section on indexing. If any of you have done indexing, you're probably familiar with this section. Today, the two sections, that we're going to be talking about are family tree, and that is the place where pedigrees and temple work are kept. And then we're also going to be talking about Family Search historical records. And if you've done indexing, the images that you've indexed are available in Family Search historical records, and the indexing that you've done has made those records searchable. So we're going to be talking about both those sections and the difference between them. So first of all, what is Family Tree? Let's talk about the goal of Family Tree in order to understand it better. The goal of Family Tree, that section of Family Search, the Family Search website, is to have one complete, accurate record for every person who's lived on the earth, linked to other records by correct relationships. So for instance, here's a visual. When you sign on to Family Tree, depending on the view that you've set, you may see something like this. And you'll see that there's just one record for each of the people here. I don't have two Joseph Aminadab Quabels, only got one Bennett Burroughs, and they're linked to each other by correct relationships. So Bennett is Joseph's dad, and we see that they're linked together that way. So that's the goal of Family Tree, is one accurate record for everybody linked to other records by correct relationships. So where did the names in family tree come from? This is so important to understand because it will affect the way that we do our family history. So when family tree, or rather its predecessors, first started out, they were populated by completed temple records, including extracted names. And if any of you are wondering what extracted names are, the extraction program was kind of the forerunner of the indexing program. So people would basically just write down names out of historical records, and then those names would be provided to the temple. When patrons went to the temple, they would get an extracted name if they didn't have their own family name. Another source of names for Family Tree is information from LDS Church membership records. And then finally, user contributions, including things like the old ancestral file that were done at the end of the 1900s, pedigree resource file, and of course, contributions that are made manually in Family Tree today. So another thing that is very important to understand about family tree is that it's a shared tree. Got an interesting email just this morning, in fact, from a friend who's a support missionary, and he mentioned that a user had called him up very frustrated because people were making changes to what she thought was her tree in family tree. And you can see how people might get that misunderstanding that they have their own personal tree in family tree because other websites work that way. For instance, if you're on Ancestry, you might have your own personal tree and you own that tree and nobody else can change it. But the purpose of family tree is to have a shared tree that everybody works on together. So nobody has their own tree. It's not my tree, it's our tree. And anybody can change any record. And the purpose of that is for all of us to collaborate together to make the best possible record that we can in family tree, backed up by good sources. So, and that leads us to another assumption that we want to question, and that is a common assumption in the church that the purpose of Family Tree is to provide temple-ready names which have already been verified by the church. But as you can see from when we looked at the data, where the data came from, that those names haven't all been verified by the church. Some of them were from completed records, but ultimately all of them came from users like you and me. Even the temple names that were submitted by users. So it's important to keep in mind that the purpose of this wonderful program called Family Tree on the FamilySearch website is to provide a place for users to collaborate on a common family tree and also to track temple work in order to avoid duplication. So let's talk about what it means to find a name. And you might have heard sometimes you'll hear maybe somebody in a testimony meeting or something, and they'll say, I found so and so, and they're so excited. Well, what exactly does it mean to find a name? Finding a name means basically finding enough information to identify a person uniquely so that you can tell them apart from every other person that is not them. And it's not done primarily in family tree, but it's done in historical records, birth, marriage, death, or etc. So, what kind of information identifies a person uniquely? Basically, we're looking for three types of information. We want to get their name, complete name if possible. We want to get life events, birth, marriage, or death. That's what that BMD stands for, and you'll probably see that a lot when you're working on genealogy sites. So, and typically the most useful date and life event is birth information, so birth dates and places. And then finally, family relationships also help us identify a person uniquely. So here's an example. There may be 500 men named John Bescabee in the history of the world, and sometimes when I look at my pedigree chart, I feel that way. But there's only one John Bescabee. Whoops, I just hit the wrong button here, folks. Give me just a second. Okay. So there may just be one John Bescabee born in 1866 in Sleaford, Lincolnshire in England, and who is also the son of John Bescabee and Jane Ellis, and who is also the husband of Emily Ferguson. So can you see how that information helps me tell this John Bescabee apart from any other John Bescabee in the world? So that is what we mean when we say that we are finding a name. So if family tree is not the main place to find names, then where do we find names? Basically, we want to look in these four types of records. Birth or christening records. Christening also is another name for baptism that is done for an infant. Marriage records will help, death or burial records, and then finally census records. And so for those of you who may be at the beginning, I just wanted to give a quick little crash course on these types of records, just giving examples of birth records and census records. So here is a sample birth record. It's actually a christening record from England. And what you see here is that this is a form that the clergyman was required to fill out anytime he baptized a child. So he put the date of the infant baptism, he put the person's name, he put their parents, he put the family surname, the place where the family was living, and also the father's occupation. Now, this clergyman did something wonderful that he wasn't required to do. He made an extra little thing out in the margin where he actually recorded the birth date, because the birth date is oftentimes almost never actually the same as the christening date, because you don't just baptize a brand new baby, you wait a little bit, maybe a couple weeks. And so this record gives a lot of valuable information about little Agnes, who was baptized, because from this record I find out her parents, where they were living, and her dad's occupation, which helps me find more information about that family in other records. So there's an example of a birth record. Let's take a quick look at census records, which are probably one of the most valuable records as you're doing your family history. So census records are a count of a nation's residents. The major ones are taken every 10 years, although there are some exceptions to that. They usually include at least the birthplace, the age, the marital status, and family relationships for every person that appears in the census record. The best available census records for England and for the US, which are mainly the ones that I find people are using in this area. US is 1850 to 1940 will be your best, and then England 1841 to 1911. You might wonder why those census records, why I don't go beyond 1940 for the US and 1911 for England. And that's because those census records actually have not been released due to privacy reasons. So for instance, there is a 1950 census, but it's not publicly available. And then finally, where would you find these census records? You can find them on FamilySearch.org, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, Find My Past. Those are probably some of the major sites. And then there are also sites, if you do a search on the web, you'll be able to find other sites. But these are probably your best bets for census records. So here's a sample census record. A little bit small, but you can see that up here at the top, they say where they're counting the people. They say where the people are living. And then there's an address for where these people are living on 8th Street. And then there's just one row for every person that they have counted. And they give the information like their relationship to the head of house. This person here is a daughter. If the person has an occupation, they'll list it. This person is a salesman. And then they'll list also the birthplaces for those persons. So that's just a quick crash course on census records. And now let's talk about how to get started. If you are at the very beginning and you haven't done this before, we're going to go to the very basics of how to get started. And actually, if you have done this before and maybe you're involved in teaching other people, this information may be helpful to you as you teach other people. So finding a place to start, how do we do that? The most important thing that I've found seriously is to pray for guidance. And you can supercharge your prayers, as I'm sure you know, by fasting and attending the temple. The temple is a great place to pray for guidance. And I found that those prayers are abundantly answered as we seek the Lord's help in doing our family history. And I love a quote that I read by David Rancher. In case you're not familiar with him, I believe his current title is, oh goodness, he's a genealogical officer, maybe the chief genealogical officer. Shoot, I should have checked that. But he is a leader at FamilySearch. And he said that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that technology is wonderful, but it didn't turn his heart. What turned his heart was connecting with his ancestors. And sometimes I found that we do let technology maybe get in the way of seeking spiritual guidance. We think that, oh, if I just use the website or just use this or that app, that it'll work. And those apps are wonderful and they do help. But as Brother Rancher said, they don't take the place of praying for guidance and receiving the help of the Spirit. It's a combined thing in my mind. So be sure to pray. And if your prayers need a little extra help, try fasting and definitely going to the temple. The next thing that's so important, this is one of those things that I wish that someone had taught me at the very beginning, is that I need to choose the correct research strategy, and we'll talk about those more, these two types, and how you choose which one is right for you. And then there's some basic guidelines for beginners that are so helpful when you're starting out, and we're going to be going over those. And then finally, actually looking for a place to start working. I'll show you an example of how just recently I helped somebody find names that needed to be added on her very full tree. So let's go ahead and start from the research strategy. I think that we covered the prayer and seeking guidance. So to choose a research strategy, I'm having a hard time with that word, huh? So to choose a research strategy, there's basically two that you will want to choose from. You can do ancestral research, which is going back from parent to parent to parent. That's for trees without much work done. So for instance, if you are a new convert and you look at your tree in FamilySearch and you're basically it, maybe your parents are there but not too much else, then you probably want to start with ancestral research. And we'll give an example of that in a minute. If, on the other hand, you have a very full tree, you open it up and you just see generations and generations that maybe Aunt Martha did or whatever, you may want to consider doing descendancy research. And that is basically going forward through the generations and finding people who need work to be done. Let's look at examples of both of those. So ancestral research, if this is you right here, you would get your parents, your mom and dad, and then you would get their parents, your grandma and grandpas on both sides, and then your greats going back, and you would just keep going back from parent to parent until the point where the records became unavailable. And again, this is a great strategy if you have a pretty empty tree. And it's often easy to get that information because you probably know a lot of these people. Your grandparents may still be alive and you can talk with them. Some of us are even blessed enough to have great-grandparents alive and you could talk with them. So if your tree is empty, you probably want to start with ancestral research. But if your tree is pretty full, here's how we would do descendancy research. So you do start with you again, and you trace your lines backwards until you come to a direct line ancestor and their spouse about 6 or 7 generations back, so to the early 1800s or the late 1700s. Then, when you've reached this direct line couple here, you do a U-turn and you trace, do all their children and the people they married. Then you do all their children and the people they married, their children and the people they married, and so far down until the privacy period. The church has instituted for the protection of its users a privacy period where they ask us not to submit names that were of people who were born less than 110 years ago unless we are directly related to them. And if not, otherwise we're either not supposed to submit those names for temple work or we're supposed to get permission from the closest living relative. Now, people will often ask on descendancy, if I find this direct line ancestor and then I go down and I find their child and the child's spouse, can I trace the spouse going back ancestrally? And the answer to that right now, according to church policy, is no. We're supposed to just do the people. We can do anybody who is a descendant of any ancestor or their spouse, but we're actually not supposed to try tracing the spouses up. And actually, to be honest, I have found that that's not a hardship at all. There is so much to be done if we follow church policy that it's not necessary to break church policy to find additional names. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's talk about some beginner guidelines. And these are things that I wish so much that I had known sooner when I was getting started. And so I hope that this saves you some of the frustration that I and others have experienced by not knowing these things. So the first guideline is so important. This may seem obvious when you hear it, but it's surprising how often we don't think about it. And that is to use what you know to discover what you don't know. And honestly, this is not just for beginners. This will serve you well throughout your genealogical efforts, even when you become an expert later on. And just as an example of using what you know to discover what you don't know, most of us know the names of our parents, or let's even say our grandparents. So you may know the names of your grandparents, but suppose that you don't know the names of your great grandparents. Well, if you find your grandparents, you know them well enough, you know when they were born, their full names, etc., that when and where they were born, full names and so forth. You could then find them in the census, and then you could find a marriage record that had their parents on. So you may not have known their parents, but knowing them, you can look for records that you absolutely know about that are about them and will tell you more information that lets you identify their parents or other relatives so that you can start extending your lines further. So use what you know to discover what you don't know. That is probably the best advice that I could give anybody doing family history, beginner or not. The next thing that's important for beginners, I would recommend that when you're working on your family history, you focus on people that were born between about 1800, maybe a little bit back into the late 1700s, but between 1800 and the privacy year, which is right now 1906, 110 years from today. And the reason for that is that the best records are available in the 1800s and forward. When you start going back too much earlier than that, the records become spotty and maybe not as complete. The handwriting is harder to decipher. Would you ever get to those records? Absolutely. What these are beginner's guidelines and just saying when you're starting out, I've seen people get very discouraged by those old records. And there are so many records in good time periods that when you're starting out, give yourself a break or give the person you're helping a break and let them focus on the records that are the easiest to use when they're learning. And then also that they have the best availability. So you're going to find the most reliable records and good records in this time period. Another thing that I learned by trying to help one of my friends with non-English records was that when you're starting out, it's usually much better to focus on English speaking. And I'm assuming that those of you who are listening are native English speakers, or if your native language is something else, then focus on that. But focus on a language that you speak. Just to give you the example of my friend, she was researching in Switzerland. We just dived in right there, and the records were all in German and neither of us spoke German. So a couple of hours later, we were both extremely frustrated, hadn't made much progress. We were having to look up, pretty much every word in the records that we found, couldn't really tell what they were saying. And so for a beginner, that is probably not the most successful experience, right? And so you want to, when you're starting out, give yourself the best opportunity for success. And sometimes I've said to people, try to work in a language you're familiar with. And if it's English, they say, wow, does that mean all I can do is America? Well, no, actually, there's a number of English speaking countries. US, England, Canada, Australia. I've seen some New Zealand records in English, and so it isn't really a thing that will limit you. And then also and remember also that's just when you're starting out. And the exception to this is if obviously you know another language. Maybe you've served a mission and you're very fluent in Spanish or Portuguese or some other language, then you are ideally prepared to read the records in those other languages. But the point is to start with the low-hanging fruit and give yourself the best chance of success when you're starting out. And when you do that, you're going to build your skills and you'll be able to move on to those more difficult records. Finally, last beginner guideline is that when you are trying to see what work needs to be done, look for the following in family tree. You want to look for people who live to adulthood and don't have a spouse so that you can add that spouse. And you also want to look for couples with few or no children so that you can add those missing children. And remember that our goal isn't really to find people in Family Tree, although occasionally you may, but the goal is to find people that you can add. So, one of the most frequent questions I get from people who are asking to learn to do family history is, okay, great, you've told me all these guidelines. Now, when the rubber hits the road, how do I really get started and find an actual place to work and find names? So this is a true experience that I had just a few weeks ago working with a friend, and she had come to me and was feeling a little bit discouraged because she had been looking for names on her very full tree and had not been. She'd been able to find maybe one or two that were already in Family Tree that had one or two ordinances that hadn't been finished, but not nearly what she was hoping for. And when I offered to help her, she was kind of skeptical. She said, I and some of my other family have looked at this, haven't had much success, don't want to waste your time. And I said, well, I'm sure glad to look if you want me to. And so she agreed. And so I went to a quiet place where I could hear those promptings of the Spirit because that's so important. And let me just put a plug in here. I don't know I think all of us who are trying to live a good Christian life and try to follow the Spirit sometimes wonder if we're hearing those promptings of the Spirit correctly. And I have found that doing family history is one of the absolute best ways to learn to recognize more fully the promptings of the Spirit. Because I can promise you, you will get those promptings. And as you see them fulfilled, as you do this family history and you get these promptings, follow them, and find success, then you can say to yourself, wow, I just learned a little bit more about how the Spirit speaks to me. So that is one of the huge blessings of doing family history is learning better to understand how the Spirit speaks to you. So I went to a quiet place where I could pray and try and receive that inspiration that I needed to help my dear friend. And as I looked, and this is what I like to do to find a place to start is to pull up the fan chart in Family Tree. That's on the tree view, and you see how this fan chart looks. There's a little icon at the top left of the page that looks very much like this. And so you just click that little icon and it brings up this fan chart with you in the center. And then if you click on that there's a fan icon on any name on the fan chart. And if you click that fan icon, it puts that person in the center of the fan. So I went in here and looked at my friend's fan chart and was trying my best to be peaceful and quiet and listen to the Spirit. And I found that I was drawn towards a certain name, and it was Abraham Chadwick. So I thought, okay, I'm going to check him out and just see how it looks and what I can find. So I went to his page. I clicked on his name and went to his page on his person page so I could see more detail about him. So you can see here that Abraham is over here on the left-hand side, and here are his parents. And I discovered that Abraham was one of the earliest people in my friend's family to join the church, which was a wonderful thing. And he had done a lot of work for his family. And so that was a reason that my friend was not having much success finding names to add to her tree. So again, as I looked over there and found, wow, their work is all done, all these people and their kids' work is done and so forth, I prayed again and tried to really again listen to the Spirit. And I felt drawn towards this particular name, Sarah Ann Chadwick. And so I thought, okay, I'd like to see more detail on Sarah Ann. So I brought her up, her person page. And so over here you see Sarah Ann, and she is married to George Bradbury, and here are all their kids. So this is where that prompting of the Spirit started to bear fruit. As I looked at each of these children, I found that most of them did not have spouses, and some of them, even though they had spouses, did not appear to have many kids. Here's an example. So I went to Samuel's page. So here's Samuel over here now on the left-hand side. And I saw, yep, he's got a wife, Kate, and he's got 3 children. But back then, it was actually pretty unusual for a family to be that small because if the both husband and wife lived for a long time, if neither of the spouses died, then they generally had large families. So I thought, okay, that's worth checking out. So you remember we talked about going to records to use what we know to find out what we don't know. So I went to the census and I was able to find Samuel and Kate and these kids in the census. But as I looked not just in one census, but I tracked the family through multiple censuses and found that 4 children were missing. And so we were able to add Eveline, Nellie, Samuel, and Sarah Ann, whose work had not been done. Not only that, bless their hearts, Kate died. And so this family lost their beloved mother, and Samuel did end up remarrying. He married a woman named Ada Sarah Hollingworth, but her work had also not been done. So this was an example of how we used what we knew to find what we didn't know, these missing children and a missing second wife. Here's another example on this same line. I went to Hannah, who is also a daughter of Sarah Ann. And as I looked at Hannah, lo and behold, no spouse, no children. But as I looked through the census, I found that at one point the married Hannah was living with Sarah Ann, who was a widow at that time, and her children were with her. So as I did further exploration, again using what I knew to find out what I didn't know, I discovered from a marriage record that Hannah had married a man named John Ogden, and I found her children in those census records, Annie, Edith, and Herbert. And so we were able to have those children prepared for temple work. So I hope that makes sense how you look and listen to the Spirit, follow those promptings, and then look for people who are missing spouses and or children, and then look in historical records to find those missing people and then add them to family tree. So let's wrap up what we've discussed today. We talked about verifying assumptions and making sure that, assumptions, they're the hardest things sometimes to verify because we don't know that, sometimes we don't even know they're assumptions, and we definitely don't know that they're false because otherwise we wouldn't hold them, right? So we hold them with the best intentions, believing they're true. But it's a good thing to question our assumptions and to change them as necessary. We talked about the difference between FamilySearch and Family Tree, that FamilySearch itself is the organization that runs the website, and Family Tree is the place where temple work is tracked and where we collaborate to build a common pedigree. We talked about what it means to find a name, which means to distinguish that person from any other person that might have that same name so that we can tell them apart and we really know them as a person, as an individual. And then finally, oh dear, just missed that. Let me go back. There we go. Finally, we talked about finding a place to start, and I gave an example of that, and I won't recap that whole thing here, but fortunately this webinar will be available on the BYU site and on YouTube, so you'll be able to rewatch it. And also my email address will be available, and you're very welcome to email me with questions. So finally, I wanted to end with one of my very favorite quotes from Henry B. Eyring. He testified, "Your ancestors' hearts are bound to you. Their hope is in your hands. You will have more than your own strength as you choose to labor on to find them." And I share with you my witness that that is true. And I wish you all the best in your family history efforts. Thank you so much for your attendance today.
So there was one question about if the presentation would be available online. And so I think that if you click right here, where it says available here, that's where you can find the copy of this presentation and others. And also, like Kathryn said, this is her email address if you want to email her for any other questions that you may have. Once again, we thank you for joining us for our webinar today. Just a reminder that this presentation will be available on our website and also our YouTube channel. Thank you so much.